Today we're going to talk about shame and the impact that shame has not only on our emotional well-being, but also on our relationships with others. And if you find these videos interesting or helpful, please consider subscribing by hitting the red button below or sharing it with others. So when patients come to see me, I can generally gauge their emotion from their eyes. In Chinese medicine, the Shen, or the person's spirit, is determined by looking through their eyes. So bright, shiny eyes, open and alert, are a sign of good health. But the patient sitting across from me last Thursday was in a lot of emotional pain. Her tears were right there on the surface, waiting to spill over. This is not uncommon. I see this a lot. When our grief becomes so unbearable, it's all we can do to contain it. Tears are usually our first response, our first release. Sophie, not her real name, had come to see me because she was curious about acupuncture. She didn't really have any health issues per se. She had a sore neck and shoulders, but that was treated by my colleagues at She Integrated Health. So she'd already had physio and chiro massage, and she was new to acupuncture. I'm like, okay, I'm game. I love patients who come to see me because they've never had acupuncture before, because it's so exciting introducing it to them and having them realize what a great effect it has on the body. So when we started chatting, I asked the usual basic health intake questions. Chief complaint, what are you here for? Her response, it was like she wanted to try acupuncture and would like to explore it. She stored a lot of tension in her neck and shoulders. In fact, she was tense all the time, quite stressed out. She was prone to anxiety, something she struggles with and does therapy with a psychologist. She also suffers with depression, but it wasn't very acute, so it wasn't something she was coming to see me for. She admitted to having a crazy childhood, and she was doing cognitive behavioral therapy every week by a therapist on Zoom. And the great thing is she has a partner who's very supportive. So we were basically 5 minutes into our conversation when she admitted to having a lot of anxiety and depression. And here's where the tears started to flow. When somebody starts telling you about their health history and they start crying right away, you know that there is a bigger issue going on. And so that's, again, when I very delicately have to take a step back and go in a quiet voice, hey, is there any history of trauma or crazy childhood or alcoholic parents? What I don't want to do is put patients on guard or re-traumatize them by asking this question. And the reality is, if you've had that kind of childhood or any kind of traumatic experience, you're holding it in. You've been holding it in for a long time because there's typically a lot of shame associated with trauma. It's not a feel-good thing. It's not something you want to brag about saying, hey, I had a crazy traumatic environment. In fact, the last thing you want anybody to know is what happened to you growing up, especially if it was something pretty rough. Traumatic experiences tend to become our family's deep, dark secrets, the kind that nobody wants to talk about. It happened, let's move on. The morning after somebody's mother gets beat up, as victims, we tend not to say anything. It's like, move on, pretend it never happened. But here's the problem. That trauma gets stored in us because it hasn't been felt, it hasn't been released. And what happens to people like the gal I was treating is that they end up becoming victims, and the victims end up protecting the perpetrators. And as a result of that, the victims tend to feel flawed and don't want to talk about it. And so they hold it. And so what happens is we end up having two faces, the person that you want us to see and the real one. So what happened in her case is, in her case, I didn't actually need to know what the trauma was. And the last thing I want to do in a session is have somebody bring up that trauma. Because they have not come to me for psychological counseling. That's not what I do. I'm there to treat the physical. But the problem is, if there's emotional damage, there's always physical damage. So as lightly and as gently as I can, I just want to verify if in fact that has happened to a person, and then we move on from that. And as Sophie and I talked, as I say, I didn't need to know the depth of her trauma. She bore the shame of it, and her health issues, when she started having health issues, all happened at critical points in her life. So remember, a body in balance doesn't get sick, but a body that is in prolonged heightened state of anxiety does. And one of the ones I see for kids that happen, like when kids come in and we're doing a health history and they've had mono in high school, that typically is a red flag that mono tends to happen in high school and university when kids are really worn out and they're studying for exams. There's a lot of stuff going on. We call it a kissing disease, but it's really an exhausted disease is probably a better way to describe it. So as Sophie sat across from me, the tears were pouring down her face, I quietly held this space for her, reiterating that shame, the shame that we feel as trauma survivors, the impact it has on our health, our sleep, and our gut. And I explained to her the impact of living in that high state of anxiety and how it takes a toll on herself, that her autoimmune system was probably dysregulated, and how using needles and healing touch, I was going to bring her back into a normal resting state. And that this was as bad as she was going to feel. Now, in Sophie's case, she looked hesitant, but there was also a look of relief on her face because this was the first time a healthcare practitioner had actually understood her trauma and what she was feeling and the impact it was having on her body. So she was game. So she climbed up on the table and we did the needles. And the needles I typically use to treat trauma, they're head and they're hand needles. So we start off at the vertex. We do 20, and then we'll do a needle here or here. Yin Tong is a needle we do a lot to stop thought because it's the thinking that is creating the dysregulation in our body. And then I'll do a needle in the center of the chest called Ren 17 to regulate Qi, to unbind the chest, to release all that excess energy she's storing. And then another one I use, it's a sequence, it's called Buddha's Triangle, and it's basically 3 points on the wrist here that all regulate and govern the heart. And then last points are usually the 4 gates, here and on the big toe. And that, the whole thing that we're doing here is we're using the needles to start moving the energy out of the body. Remember, think of a helium balloon. The emotions fill up the balloon. We store that in our body. My goal is to pop the balloon and release the emotions and bring the person back into regulation. So once I'm done the needles, then I will usually put my hands on their feet to ground them, to hold them, to get them to a place of safety and security. And the healing touch usually takes about 15 to 20 minutes. But I know when people have hit a point where they're letting go, when they have these big diaphragm breaths, like there's these big inhales and deep, deep, deep exhales. And I usually know that we've rounded the corner when I start to see those big breaths and the person just go to a more quiet space. And once I finish the healing touch, they usually have about 15 minutes alone to do more releasing. And so after I left Sophie and let her do some more releasing when I came back in, she admitted to doing more work and more tears and more deep sighs afterwards. So the great thing is for me when I do acupuncture and healing touch, it's when people come to me, they're very emotional. So when we sit down and do the intake, it's just like they're just holding so much, right? And the reality is they just hold that every day, and then when something happens, it becomes too much. And so when they come in to see me, I can usually pretty well gauge by the eyes, by how quickly they're talking, if they've got restless leg syndrome, by the myriad of health issues they have. And so it's always interesting to get them on the table, to do the acupuncture, do the healing touch. But my favorite part is when I come in afterwards and you see people, they're calm, and it's like they're deflated, but it's not a bad deflated. It's like oh, this is what calm feels like. This is what peace feels like. And that, and you can tell right away when you look at their eyes, they're clear, right? They're no longer that emotional. It's more like a cleanse, a release. And so in Sophie's case, her eyes were clear. They were puffy and they were red because she'd been crying, but you could tell she was calm and grounded. And the biggest thing for her is she felt peace. And for people like her, they have not felt peace in a long time. And so that is just another example of why we love using acupuncture to treat trauma, because it works. And it's interesting because acupuncture isn't the first thing you would think of when it comes to treating trauma, but it certainly is a very effective way to treat trauma, and one of many things that we need to do to help treat trauma as part of a trauma-informed support team. So I'm Dr. Julie Nelson, and thanks very much for watching.